Finwë and Míriel are fictional characters from J.R.R. Tolkien's legendarium. Finwë, sometimes surnamed Noldóran, is the first king of the Noldor to lead his people on the journey from Middle-earth to Valinor in the blessed realm of Aman. Finwë's first wife was Míriel, who died while giving birth to their only child Fëanor, creator of the Silmarils. Her spirit would later serve the Vala Queen Ver as a historian. The story of Finwë and Míriel has been described as an extraordinarily important element of Tolkien's mythology. The Silmarillion, prepared by Christopher Tolkien from his father's unpublished writings, only briefly mentions the tale, although sources suggest that Tolkien had intended to incorporate a fuller version. Synopsis. The events described in the Silmarillion, as in J.R.R. Tolkien's other Middle-earth writings, were meant to have taken place at some time in Earth's past. In keeping with this idea, the Silmarillion was supposedly translated from Bilbo's 3-volume translations from the Elvish, which he wrote while at Rivendell. The book covers the history of the world, Arda, up to the Third Age, in its 5 sections. I Inulindal/I and I Valaquenta/I. None. I Quenta Silmarillion/I. None. I Akalabeth/I. None. I of the Rings of Power and the Third Age/I. None. Illustrations. The inside title page contains an inscription written in Tengwar. In English it reads: "The tales of the First Age when Morgoth dwelt in Middle-earth and the elves made war upon him for the recovery of the Silmarils, to which are appended the downfall of Númenor and the history of the Rings of Power and the Third Age in which these tales come to their end." Inside the back cover is a fold-out map of part of Middle-earth, Beleriand in the First Age. Publication. The first edition was brought out in hardback by Alan and Unwin in 1977. HarperCollins published a paperback edition in 1999, and an illustrated edition with color plates by Ted Naismith in 2008. The book has been translated into at least 28 languages. It has sold over 1 million copies, far fewer than The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which have each sold over 100 million copies. Concept and creation. Development. Tolkien began working on the stories that would become the Silmarillion in 1914. He intended them to become an English mythology that would explain the origins of English history and culture. Much of this early work was written while Tolkien, then a British officer returned from France during World War I, was in hospital and on sick leave. He completed the first story, The Fall of Gondolin, in late 1916. He called his collection of nascent stories the Book of Lost Tales. This became the name for the first 2 volumes of the History of Middle-earth, a book series by Christopher Tolkien which include these early texts. The stories employ the narrative framing device of a mariner named Míriel who finds the island of Tol Eressëa, where the elves live, and the elves tell him their history. In The Cottage of Lost Play, Tol Eressëa, corresponding to England, or in early versions Court Irion, corresponding to Warwick, linked the tales to England's lost mythology. Tolkien never completed the Book of Lost Tales. He left it to compose the poems The Lay of Lithien and The Lay of the Children of Hurin. The first version of the Silmarillion was the sketch of the mythology written in 1926. The sketch was a 28-page synopsis written to explain the background of the story of Turin to R.W. Reynolds, a friend to whom Tolkien had sent several of the stories. From the sketch, Tolkien developed a fuller narrative version of the Silmarillion called Quenta Noldóranwe. The Quenta Noldóranwe was the last version of the Silmarillion that Tolkien completed. In 1937, encouraged by the success of The Hobbit, Tolkien submitted to his publisher George Allen and Unwin an incomplete but more fully developed version of the Silmarillion called Quenta Silmarillion, but they rejected the work as being obscure and too Celtic. The publisher instead asked Tolkien to write a sequel to The Hobbit. Tolkien began to revise the Silmarillion, but soon turned to the sequel, which became The Lord of the Rings. He renewed work on the Silmarillion after completing The Lord of the Rings, and he greatly desired to publish the two works together. When it became clear that would not be possible, Tolkien turned his full attention to preparing The Lord of the Rings for publication. Tolkien wished to make the mythology more believable by bringing it into line with the round-world version of the creation story. He was persuaded not to do this in 1946. Later attempts conflicted with the already published texts of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. In the late 1950s, Tolkien returned to the Silmarillion, working mostly with the theological and philosophical underpinnings of the work rather than with the narratives. By this time, he had doubts about fundamental aspects of the work that went back to the earliest versions of the stories, and it seems that he felt the need to resolve these problems before he could attempt a final version. During this time he wrote extensively on such topics as the nature of evil in Arda, the origin of orcs, the customs of the elves, the nature and means of elvish rebirth, the flat world and the story of the sun and moon. In any event, with one or two exceptions, he wrought little change to the narratives during the remaining years of his life. Posthumous publication. For several years after his father's death, Christopher Tolkien worked on a Silmarillion narrative. He tried to use the latest writings of his fathers and to keep as much internal consistency as possible, given the many conflicting drafts. He enlisted the help of the Canadian Guy Gavriel Kay, now the author of a fantasy trilogy inspired by Arthurian legend. Kay spent a year with him in Oxford editing the materials in secret. As explained in the History of Middle-earth, Christopher Tolkien drew upon numerous sources, relying on post-Lord of the Rings works where possible, ultimately reaching as far back as the 1917 Book of Lost Tales to fill in portions of the narrative that his father had planned to write but never addressed. In one later chapter of Quenta Silmarillion, of the ruin of Doriath, untouched since the early 1930s, he had to construct a narrative practically from scratch. Christopher Tolkien commented that, had he taken more time and had access to all the texts, he might have produced a substantially different work. In his foreword to the Book of Lost Tales 1 in 1983, he wrote that, by its posthumous publication nearly a quarter of a century later, the natural order of presentation of the whole matter of Middle-earth was inverted, and it is certainly debatable whether it was wise to publish in 1977 a version of the primary legendarium standing on its own and claiming, as it were, to be self-explanatory. The published work has no framework, no suggestion of what it is and how it came to be. This I now think to have been an error. In October 1996, Christopher Tolkien commissioned the illustrator Ted Naismith to create full-page full-color artwork for the first illustrated edition of the Silmarillion. It was published in 1998, and followed in 2004 by a second edition featuring corrections and additional artwork by Naismith. Influences. The Silmarillion was influenced by many sources. A major influence was the Finnish epic Kalevala, especially the tale of Kullervo. Influence from Greek mythology is also apparent in the way that the island of Numenor recalls Atlantis, and the Vala borrow many attributes from the Olympian gods. The Vala, like the Olympians, live in the world, but on a high mountain, separated from mortals. The correspondences are only approximate. The Vala are also influenced by Norse mythology, with characteristics resembling various of the Aesir, the gods of Asgard. Thor, for example, physically the strongest of the gods, can be seen both in Arom, who fights the monsters of Melkor, and in Tulkas, the physically strongest of the Vala. Manwë, the head of the Vala, exhibits some similarities to Odin, the Alfather. Tolkien also said that he saw the Maya Olorin as an Odinic wanderer. The influence of the Bible is seen in the conflict between Melkor and Eru Iluvatar, a parallel of the polarity of Lucifer and God. Further, the creation and fall of the elves parallels the Genesis account of the creation and fall of man. As with all of Tolkien's works, the Silmarillion allows room for later Christian history, and one draft even has Finrod speculating on the necessity of Eru's eventual incarnation to save mankind. Verlin Flieger sees the influence of medieval Christian cosmology, especially in the account of the creation of the universe, as the manifestation of a sort of song sung by God with which the angels harmonize until the fallen angel introduces discord. Saint Augustine's writings on music, as well as the extensive medieval tradition of the divine harmony more familiar to us today in the notion of the music of the spheres, served as basis for this telling of creation. Scholars such as Dimitra Fimi have documented the influence of Celtic mythology in the exile of the Noldóran elves, borrowing elements from the story of Irish legends of the Tuatha De Danann. Welsh influence is seen in the Elvish language Synd Éireann. Tolkien wrote that he gave it a linguistic character very like British Welsh, because it seems to fit the rather Celtic type of legends and stories told of its speakers. Reception. At the time of release, reviews of the Silmarillion were generally negative. The Tolkien scholar Wayne G. Hammond records that the book's publisher, Rayner Unwin, called the reviews among the most unfair he had ever seen. The book was a commercial success, topping the New York Times fiction bestseller list in October 1977. It won the Locus Award for Best Fantasy Novel in 1978. The Silmarillion was criticized for being too serious, lacking the light-hearted moments that were found in The Lord of the Rings and especially The Hobbit. Time magazine lamented that there was no single, unifying quest and, above all, no band of brothers for the reader to identify with. Other criticisms included difficult-to-read archaic language and many difficult and hard-to-remember names. Robert M. Adams of the New York Review of Books called the Silmarillion an empty and pompous bore and not a literary event of any magnitude. He suggested that the main reason for its enormous sales was the Tolkien cult created by the popularity of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and predicted that more people would buy the Silmarillion than would ever read it. The school library journal called it only a stillborn postscript to Tolkien's earlier works. Peter Conrad of the New Statesman stated that Tolkien can't actually write and was deficient in imagination. A few reviewers praised the scope of Tolkien's creation. The New York Times Book Review acknowledged that what is finally most moving is the eccentric heroism of Tolkien's attempt. Time described the Silmarillion as majestic, a work held so long and so powerfully in the writer's imagination that it overwhelms the reader. The Hornbook magazine lauded the remarkable set of legends conceived with imaginative might and told in beautiful language. John Calvin Batchelor, in The Village Voice, lauded the book as a difficult but incontestable masterwork of fantasy and praised the characterization of Melkor, describing him as a stunning bad guy whose chief weapon against goodness is his ability to corrupt men by offering them trappings for their vanity. In a 2019 article, L. E. Mond called the Silmarillion a cornerstone of Tolkien's imagination and the book by J.R.R. Tolkien that rules them all. Analysis. A challenge to complete. Academic criticism of Christopher Tolkien's 1977 text concentrated on his father's intention to complete the work. Since he did not do so, his plans for the overall narrative, out of the large collection of draft texts, were not clearly discernible. That in turn meant, argued the Tolkien scholar Charles Node, that Silmarillion criticism ought first to evolve approaches to this textual complex as it, including Christopher Tolkien's 1977 Silmarillion. Gurgly Nagy writes that the Silmarillion is long both in Middle-earth time and in years of Tolkien's life, and it provides the impression of depth for both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. It is, however, in his view immensely problematic as it is not a work as usually understood. The Silmarillion is the enormous corpus of documents and drafts that J.R.R. Tolkien built up throughout his creative life, while the Silmarillion is the 1977 book that Christopher Tolkien edited. The corpus is now published in the 12 volumes of Christopher Tolkien's The History of Middle-earth. The corpus is not a single work but many versions of many works, while the book is often regarded as not an authentic Tolkien text. Tolkien did not authorize the 1977 text, he did not even write all of it, and he did not define the frame in which it was to be presented. Nagy notes that in 2009, Douglas Charles Kane published a hugely important resource, his Arda Reconstructed, which defines exactly from what sources, variants, and with what methods Christopher Tolkien constructed the 1977 book. A presented collection. Verlin Flieger analyses at length Tolkien's way of thinking of his own mythology as a presented collection, with a frame story that changed over the years, first with a seafarer called Míriel or Ælfwine who records the sayings of the fairies or translates the Golden Book of the sages Rúmil or Pengalo. Later, he decided that the hobbit Bilbo Baggins collected the stories into the Red Book of Westmarch, translating Elvish documents in Rivendell. Nagy observes that this means that Tolkien thought of his works as texts within the fictional world, and that the overlapping of different accounts was central to his desired effect. Nagy notes that Tolkien went so far with his artwork as to create facsimile pages from the Dwarves' Book of Maze-Arbul that is found by the Fellowship in Moria. Further, Tolkien was a philologist. Nagy comments that Tolkien may have been intentionally imitating the philological style of Elias Lönnrot, compiler of the Finnish epic, the Kalevala, or of Saint Jerome, Snorri Sturluson, Jacob Grimm, or Nikolai Grundtvig, all of whom Tolkien saw as exemplars of a professional and creative philology. This was, Nagy believes, what Tolkien thought essential if he was to present a mythology for England, since such a thing had to have been written by many hands. Further, writes Nagy, Christopher Tolkien inserted himself in the functional place of Bilbo as editor and collator, in his view reinforcing the mythopoeic effect that his father had wanted to achieve, making the published book do what Bilbo's book was meant to do, and so realizing his father's intention. Themes. The Silmarillion is thematically complex. One key theme is its nature as a mythology, with multiple interrelated texts in differing styles. David Bratman has named these as analytic, antique and appendical. All of these are far from the approachable novelistic styles of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, lacking a single narrative thread, and without the benefit of hobbits as guides. As Tolkien noted in a letter. Another major theme is sensitively analyzed by Flieger in her 2002 book Splintered Light, which Nagy notes was the first full monograph on the Silmarillion. Flieger shows that a central theme of Tolkien's writing is the progressive fragmentation of the light from the moment of the creation. Light symbolizes both the divine creation and the author's subcreation. Key symbols including the two trees of Valinor, the Silmarils themselves, the transformation of Arundel the mariner and his ship Vingilot into the morning star, and the white tree of Numenor all embody the light. A further theme is that of secondary creation or mythopoeia, linking Tolkien's beliefs about mythology, language, and art, including music with his Catholicism. The fictional secondary world can be beautiful because it mirrors God's creation. The Ainulindal directly describes the creation of Arda as an artistic process, the music of the Ainur having its own beauty but also awakening the world into being. Influence in music. In 1998, the German power metal band Blind Guardian released a concept album about the events in the book titled Nightfall in Middle-earth. The Norwegian classical composer Martin Romberg has written 3 full-scale symphonic poems, Quendi, Telperion et Laurelin, and Fëanor, inspired by passages from the Silmarillion. The works were premiered by orchestras in southern France between 2009 and 2017. The British rock band Silmarillion and the French black metal band Silmarillion took their names from the book. Notes. References.